In this video, we're going to continue our discussion on mobile app development considerations. We've talked about the first few bullet points in previous videos, so now we're going to explore integrated development environments, or IDE. So what is an IDE? An integrated development environment is a place where we can write our program, we can compile our program, in other words, we change it from language that is readable to you and me to language that is readable by the computer, or what we'll call machine language. We can run our program in an emulator, which is something that looks like a mobile device but is actually running on our computer. And probably most importantly, we can debug our program. When you're a developer, debugging is one of the most important things that you'll do because you can watch the program run at your own pace. And you can do some what-if analysis by changing variables during runtime. In other words, changing maybe what the user would input or what the user would see in return. Now, in IDE, many of them are multi-purpose, which means that you can develop different software for different applications with an IDE. And many of them are extendable with things called plugins. So enhancements that you can get to do things like test your application and also look at test coverage of your application source code. One thing that an IDE will do specifically for mobile development is you can package your project for deployment. So when you actually deploy an app on the Play Store or whatever app store you use, it's typically going to take one file. In Android, we call that an APK file, which is essentially the entire program in a compressed file with a little bit of intelligence on what the program name is and some other features, some other attributes like that. So there are several different IDEs that we can use, and we will take a look at a couple of these in this video. If you're developing for iPhone, your choice really is Xcode. That is the iPhone IDE. To my knowledge, that only runs on a Mac. Now, honestly, Mac or iPhone or Android, I'm indifferent. I tend to do a lot of development in Android purely because I do a lot of development when I'm traveling. My job requires a bit of travel. And typically, when I'm traveling, I have a Windows-based laptop with me, so that's the easiest tool that I can use. So Android Studio is what we'll use for Android development, and that you can run on a Mac or you can run it on Windows, you can run it on a Linux workstation. Also, there's something that's a really nice thing if you don't have a whole lot of programming experience, and that's called AppInventor. Later this semester, we're going to have an entire learning module on AppInventor. If we take a look at our learning modules, learning module 6 is AppInventor for Android, and that's our focus for that learning module. Now, AppInventor is very easy to use if you've never programmed before. So don't feel intimidated about this. It's a very simple environment. Now, Visual Studio is what we traditionally used to build Windows Phone-based apps, but the Windows Phone isn't very popular at the moment. That being said, there is a nice use of Visual Studio that I've found, and that is with Cordova. Cordova is something you'll probably hear a lot about, which is a way to write an application one time using HTML, JavaScript, CSS, things you may or may not be familiar with, and then do native builds in each environment where you want to run your program. So you can write a Cordova app and then build it in Android Studio, build it in Xcode, or build it in Visual Studio. Now, I tried Cordova with Android and also with Windows Phone. And honestly, I found the setup with Visual Studio to be very straightforward. So a video that follows this, we're going to take a look at that Cordova with Cordova with Visual Studio. So if we take a look at the Android-based IDEs, there's something for everybody here. Are you a programmer by trade? If so, then Android Studio makes a lot of sense. Have you never programmed before? If so, then AppInventor makes a lot of sense. Have you written a web page before and you're familiar with CSS, JavaScript, and HTML? In that case, Cordova makes a lot of sense, whether you do it with Android Studio or you write it in Visual Studio and then port it over to Android Studio and do a build from there. So we'll take a look at a couple of IDEs here. We'll start with Android Studio, and then we'll take a look at AppInventor. Remember, Android Studio is the one for programmers, so when we look at it, it's going to look a little bit intimidating. We have on the left side, we have this kind of directory structure where we have a file up here called Android Manifest, and this is something that's human readable, easy to edit. Now under that, we have a Java folder with a whole bunch of classes. If we take a look at DAO, for instance, we'll see that I click on something on the left, and that file opens on the right, and we see a whole lot of programming syntax, things like open curly, semicolons, and all these symbols that we use in programming. If you're a programmer, probably makes a lot of sense. If not, it probably looks kind of goofy. If I want to create a new class, so these are Java classes or little Java programs that work well together, I could say specimen DAO, like so, and choose OK. Watch on the left, it's going to create a new file called specimen DAO, and then on the right, it's going to open that file, and I can do something like, say, public void fetch specimen, like so, which is making a method. Now, this class doesn't require programming, so I don't expect you to know this. That's okay. I just want to give you a little taste of what it looks like in this development environment. Now, let's compare and contrast that with the AppInventor development environment. This is it. Now, one thing that you'll notice about AppInventor is, guess what? It's browser-based. So the Android Studio IDE, this is well over a gigabyte. It requires a lot of time to download, and it constantly needs to be updated. There are a lot of different parts that need to be updated. There is a bit of work in maintaining this. On the flip side, the AppInventor IDE, you just go to this URL, ai2.appinventor.mit.edu, log in with something like a Google ID, and there you go. You can see all of your projects here. So if I go to my projects, we'll see that I have quite a few projects I've built over time, mostly just while doing some kind of class. This project is one where I was building a learn chemistry game where you can take a carbon element, hydrogen, and oxygen, put them into the box over here, and you can make different molecules out of it. So you see, for the user interface, all we have to do is drag from the left and put it on the right. It's very easy to use. Now, what about the source code? Because this view, remember taking a look at this view where we have all these symbols and all these words. Well, what is the equivalent in AppInventor? Well, the equivalent is blocks. And you see in blocks view, what we're doing is we are dragging puzzle pieces from the left over to the right, okay? So something like this, we can just drag in, make this foo like so, something like so. It's very simple because it's just a drag and drop environment. So it's very easy, if you've never programmed before, to put together an application. Now this one's pretty big. They're not all this intimidating. They're not all this big. The reason is there was just a lot of logic in determining, okay, what's one carbon and one oxygen? Well, that's carbon monoxide. What's one carbon and two oxygens? That's carbon dioxide. So there was a lot of logic required to program that, which is why you see quite a few puzzle pieces here. If you're thinking of a very simple app, probably not going to require as much logic, but either way, very easy to use. Okay, so that's an IDE, write, compile, run, debug. One thing that we'll find with an IDE, especially in mobile development, is this concept of an emulator. An emulator is a piece of software that emulates a mobile phone on your computer. So Android Studio comes with an emulator, and so does AppInventor. We'll start by looking at Android Studio's emulator for the Plant Places application. So Android Studio, and then we have this emulator. Now, you see the emulator looks a lot like a phone. You can also plug in your phone with an IDE charging cable, and you can actually run the app directly on your phone if you wish as well. So you don't have to, because you can always use this emulator, but you certainly can, and a lot of people find that to be a better environment. Now, If you don't have an Android phone and you're doing Android development, you have two options. One, run it in the emulator. Two, just go buy a cheap phone, like one of the prepaid phones, and plug it in with the IDE cable, debug like that. If you do have an Android phone, you can debug on your phone, but I'll also tell you, hang on to your old phones because that gives you something else that you can use to test and debug your application. And in Android development, we need to test on multiple devices. Now, just a side note, there's something called Firebase, which is where we can upload our software and it will simulate our application running on different devices. That's a good idea as well if you're doing some, if you want to test your app on different devices, but that's a side note. In any case, the purpose of this screen is to GPS a plant at a certain location. So you see, I can start typing in Cercis, and we'll take Cercis canadensis, traveler. Okay. One really nice thing about this is I can put, well, let's see, I'll put in a description, an excellent plant location. We'll say University of Cincinnati or something close to that, and then save. So one really nice thing about this is that I have an option to debug. Watch what happens when I press the save button. You see the IDE has changed. You can kind of see some things have lit up back here. And what this allows me to do is walk through my source code one line at a time at my own pace. And we can see the value, if you look carefully on the right in this kind of gray text or in the kind of greenish text here, we can see the value of all of the variables that I'm changing in memory, which is really nice if you want to watch your program run and make sure that it's running as you expect it to run. It's also nice just to see how the program works, because as you saw the blue line move from one line to another, I was pressing F8 on my keyboard, which says, okay, go ahead and execute this line and then move to the next. And then there we go. Okay, so emulator, quite nice. Now, what about AppInventor? Well, AppInventor has an emulator as well. As a matter of fact, the only thing you really need to install on your computer to use AppInventor, and this is optional, is something called AI Starter. An AI Starter is a bridge that allows the browser to connect to an emulator like this. Now, if you don't want to install this, maybe you're on a public computer or you don't have admin access, that's okay. Because you can use USB debugging to debug with an actual device, or you can use something called AI Companion, which is quite handy. In that case, you install something called AI Companion on your phone, if it's an Android phone, and then when you click AI Companion, it puts a little QR code on the screen. You can just scan that with your phone, and then it puts your application on your phone. You can debug it through there. So several options with AppInventor. Let's take a look at this learning chemistry game that I mentioned. What I can do is maybe drag a carbon over here and drag a couple of oxygens, and you see it shows doing it just as I would do it with an actual device. So you see as I connect the oxygen and the carbon, we get carbon monoxide. Another one, well, that should be carbon dioxide, right? Shouldn't it? But nonetheless, we could save this. We could call it carbon dioxide, okay, because there are two oxygens. And then we go ahead and save and say, okay, we have created a new molecule. So in any case, what we see here is that we can emulate an AppInventor project. We'll go ahead and let's see. We'll go ahead and clear that, put those back to where they were. We could create something else. We could create hydrogen, take hydrogen and a couple of oxygens. We could make water if we want, or actually it'd be two hydrogens, wouldn't it? So two hydrogens and an oxygen, and we could make water. So we could call this water. And you see where we're going here. I can go ahead and choose save. The idea with this game is that you can name molecules and then you can also guess molecules. So you can press random and it will say, okay, can you put together the elements that are required to make water, to make carbon dioxide? But nonetheless, that's a good look at the emulator that comes with AppInventor. I will go ahead and shut this down now. I'll go ahead and kill off my emulator and choose a reset connection. And now I'm going to go to AI Companion and take a look at that. That's the QR code that I mentioned earlier, and you see how quickly that came up. Now with my phone, with the AI Companion installed, I can simply scan this QR code, and this application will run on my phone if I have that AppInventor Companion on my phone. So several different options available to you on AppInventor, the USB debugging, the QR code, or the emulator that runs on the computer itself. In any case, very easy to set up, very easy to use this. Okay, so that's an emulator, one of the most important parts we're going to have with our developing our application. So let's talk a little bit about programming languages. If we look over the history of programming the mobile world, in the say in the 2000s through, well, like around 2000 through 2012 or so, or 2010, if you wanted to write a game or you wanted to write a software for a mobile phone, Nokia and BlackBerry were really two options, and they're two names you don't hear from much anymore, which is a shame because they used a nice pure development model. Nokia, all you had to know was Java, Java ME, Java Micro Edition. You could take an application written on a Nokia phone and run it on a BlackBerry phone because BlackBerry also used Java ME, and then they added some extensions to it. So this is in that era of about 2000 through 2010. Now these aren't necessarily the first programmable mobile phones. We had programmable mobile phones back in the 90s, but they didn't have the kind of memory that we have today. Now, don't get me wrong, mobile phones are still memory restricted, but not as much as they were back in the 90s. But nonetheless, in 2006, 2008, Nokia, BlackBerry, those were really the ways to go if you wanted to make a programmable phone app. If we go more recently, around 2008, 2010, around that era, the iPhone came out, and all of a sudden we had a revolutionary device that was really good at integration and also was really good at developing applications. So iPhone came out with Objective-C, which was really a programmer's language. More recently, it uses a programming concept called Swift. The one consideration is that you do have to have a Mac to develop for an iPhone. I'm sure somebody's made some other option out there that I don't know about, but the last research I've done has said, yes, you need a Mac, which honestly has been the only reason I've never developed an iPhone app, is that I develop my apps while I'm traveling a lot, and I don't want to carry two laptops with me. But if you have a Mac, it's a great option. If that's the laptop or the computer that you have, definitely something good to explore, is a lot of people who have iPhones are very used to this concept of applications. Now, after iPhone, for a while, honestly, it was iPhone and BlackBerry were the big two. After iPhone, Android came out, and Android is a bit of a hybrid environment. In theory, there's a little C or C++ under the covers, but as a programmer, we're going to write our programs with Java. But it's not pure Java like we saw on Nokia or BlackBerry. It's a special kind of Java that is going to compile to what's called a Dalvik virtual machine. So not a standard Java virtual machine, but a Dalvik virtual machine that is optimized for the Android device. Okay, so if you know Java, Android's a great place to get started. If you have a Mac, iPhone's a great place to get started. So again, not saying one's better than the other, just these are your options based on what your experience is to date. For Windows Phone, it uses C#, but really if I were developing for Windows Phone or any kind of Windows tablet device, I would seriously think about Cordova, which used to be called PhoneGap. And that's the idea of HTML and JavaScript. So if you've done some web development before, you already have a head start. The nice thing about Cordova for Windows Phone is, number one, I mentioned it's really easy to do with Visual Studio, and our next video is going to talk about how to do that. But the other thing is, you can easily reapply that application to iPhone and Android. You just have to do a native build. Now, what's a native build? A native build means you take the HTML, JavaScript, CSS, the stuff you use to write the Cordova. You copy it into Android Studio for Android or Xcode for iPhone, and then you build it there for that actual device. So native build means that you just have to bring it into that IDE and build it specifically for that device. But in any case, that's something worth looking at. Honestly, I do see a lot of Windows tablets, so let's not rule this one out. Okay, so platform comparison. I've talked a lot about this so far, so I don't want to be terribly repetitive. iOS is definitely a tech-savvy crowd and you have a large user base. The only thing is, of course, we said you do need a Mac to do development, and also the market is saturated. So if you want to do a to-do list app, there are probably dozens out there already. You really have to do something that stands apart from the crowd. Android, very similar, tech-savvy crowd, large user base. The downfall of Android is you have to consider these many different devices, and you have to make sure your program runs on the different devices. It is also a saturated market. So again, there are hundreds and hundreds of to-do lists out there. If you want something that's unique and different, you really have to find a way to stand out. Now there are the others. There are a lot of other different platforms that maybe don't have that saturated market. And we always have to be aware of the new and innovative things that are coming. If you told me in 2006 that it would be nearly impossible to find or purchase a Nokia phone, I never would have believed you. Back in 2006, they had a very strong market presence around the world, something like 48%, absolutely huge. Android, even when it started, it was like, well, okay, are people actually going to go to this? And they did. iOS, that one, when iPhone came out, people swarmed to it very quickly, and it was a real game changer. So we have to be aware that people do change devices about every 2 years, and iOS and Android might not be the leading two 10 years from now. There might be something else, so let's keep our options open. And for that reason, we might want to put special attention to Cordova because we know that an investment in Cordova is something that will pay off on multiple platforms. The cost to deploy on iOS, a developer license is $99 per year. On Android, it's a one-time $25 fee. So, if you're kind of just testing out a little bit and you're going to do it in both iOS and Android, and you want to see what the market's like, it might be worth doing it in Android first if you're not sure if your concept is going to fly. Now, iOS does look a bit more expensive, but just kind of as a rule of thumb, people who have iPhones are willing to pay for apps. So Android, not so much. Android, you can definitely charge for an app, but a lot of times people just expect it to be free. So while the iOS cost is a little bit higher, there's a good shot you're going to recoup your money through the price that you charge for the app as well. So that is a quick look at some IDEs, some differences, some advantages and disadvantages of each platform. Hopefully that will save you a little bit of time as you think, gosh, I have experience in HTML, CSS. I'm going to look at Cordova. I have no experience. I just want to play a little bit. I have a relatively simple app or a graphic-intensive app. I'm going to think AppInventor, or I'm a programmer. I want that debugging experience. I'm going to take a look then at Android Studio. So hopefully that's been a bit of a help. And of course, we'll explore these topics a lot more in our future videos. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.